Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into the absolute powerhouse that was Frantz Fanon. We're going to unpack the monumental and, honestly, explosive legacy of this revolutionary psychiatrist, philosopher, and writer. Tragically, he died of leukemia when he was just 36 years old. But his ideas? They completely altered how we understand the psychological, cultural, and political mechanics of colonial oppression. His work is famous for bridging this massive gap between treating the individual human mind and treating an entirely sick society.
Okay, let's kick things off with a provocative thought from Fanon that perfectly captures his whole vibe on dismantling racist cultures. The end of race prejudice begins with a sudden incomprehension. So, what does he mean by that? Well, he's saying racism isn't just some personal attitude or a random glitch in the system. It's literally woven into the DNA of how a society operates. To actually end it, that culture has to become entirely unrecognizable to us. You can't just tweak the system. It requires a sudden, radical break from the past.
And that brings us to the driving question of this explainer. How on earth did a 36-year-old psychiatrist become the voice of global decolonization? Seriously, how does a medical professional who started out studying the human mind turn into this revolutionary icon whose books are still the go-to texts for liberation movements all over the world today? To figure that out, we really have to look at his life.
Section 1. Martinique to the Metropole, the Roots of Alienation. Let's see how Fanon's early lived experiences laid the groundwork for his groundbreaking theories.
His life was a total whirlwind. He was born in 1925 on the French Caribbean island of Martinique into a middle-class family. And growing up, he totally thought of himself as French. He even eagerly volunteered for military service in World War II in 1944. After the war, he gets his medical and psychiatric degree in Lyon, France in 1951. 2 years later, he moves to Algeria to practice psychiatry, and everything changes. Tragically, the whole journey is cut way too short by his death in 1961 in Bethesda, Maryland.
Let's zoom in on that 1944 military service for a second, because it's a massive turning point. He signs up for the Free French Forces, enthusiastic to fight the Nazis. But what he actually finds when he gets to Europe and North Africa is just a profound shock. Systemic anti-blackness. He sees these incredibly stark racial hierarchies in the military, where white troops are treated vastly differently than black and Arab troops. That experience completely shattered his eagerness to fight for France, sparking this deep, deep disillusionment that fueled all of his later writing.
Which leads us to Section 2, Black Skin, White Masks, The Psychology of Racism. This is his first major work, published in 1952 when he was only 27. Here, he takes his psychiatric training and his own lived experience and uses them to diagnose the psychological wounds of colonial subjugation.
In the book, Fanon shares this super visceral famous anecdote to explain how racism actually operates on the mind. He describes a moment where a white child points at him and yells, "Look, a Negro." Fanon explains that this racist gaze isn't just an insult, it acts almost like a physical blow. It fixes his identity entirely from the outside. In that moment, his individuality is totally stripped away, and he is reduced down to nothing but his skin color in the eyes of the white world.
He calls this crucial concept the zone of non-being. He describes it as the hell of blackness when you honestly confront your condition in an anti-black world. But here's the really fascinating twist. Descending into this psychological hell doesn't mean you just fall into despair or nihilism. Actually, Fanon argues that by fully facing this erasure head-on, it ignites a yes that vibrates with cosmic harmony. It creates this incredibly positive, revolutionary affirmation of life that a racist world simply cannot contain.
You see, for Fanon, colonialism is a total project. It infiltrates absolutely everything. It's like a trap that locks both groups into these rigid, ontological cages. The colonizer gets locked in whiteness, constantly relying on an assumed sense of superiority, right? Meanwhile, the colonized is locked in blackness, burdened by this heavy, imposed inferiority complex. So both sides are actually alienated from true humanity by the colonial structure.
Now here's where it gets super interesting regarding language, which he dives into right in Chapter 1. He argues that speaking a language means adopting a civilization, right? You're participating in a world. But for the colonized, speaking the colonizer's language means actively participating in your own alienation. Even if a black speaker has flawless French diction, something he calls the epidermal character of race, they're still marked by their skin. Perfecting the colonizer's tongue doesn't bring equality because of those inescapable physical markers. The promise that you can integrate through language is just a mirage. Why? Because the racist society is always going to see the skin before it hears the perfect grammar. Section 3. The Algerian Revolution. The Pivot to Revolution. Let's head over to North Africa, where Fanon's clinical work puts him right in the crosshairs of a brutal anti-colonial war. While in Algeria, he takes the job as the chef de service at the Blida Joinville Hospital. But as the Algerian War of Independence kicks off, he finds himself in an absolutely impossible situation. On one hand, he's treating the psychological trauma of French soldiers who are carrying out torture. And on the other hand, he's secretly treating the Algerian torture victims. The contradiction is just too much. By 1956, he resigns so he can openly join the Algerian National Liberation Front, or FLN, which ultimately leads to him being exiled to Tunis.
He comes to this incredibly profound realization during this time. Treating patients just wasn't enough if the society itself was fundamentally sick. Clinical sociotherapy can only go so far, you know? The anxiety and trauma he was seeing in his patients weren't just internal neuroses, they were being directly installed by a violent colonial order. So for true mental health to exist, that entire colonial structure had to be completely overthrown.
And that brings us to Section 4, The Wretched of the Earth, Violence and Decolonization. This is his explosive 1961 manifesto. By this point, he's broadened his focus from the psychology of anti-blackness to the oppressed across the entire global South. And amazingly, he wrote this hugely influential book furiously while knowing he was dying of leukemia.
In it, he analyzes colonized society by breaking it down into three main groups. First, you have the worker. They depend on the colonial system to survive, but they hold revolutionary potential because their labor fuels the whole machine. Second is the colonized intellectual. They're kind of a compromised figure who translates the colonizer's world but often acts against the masses. And third is the lumpen proletariat. These are the slum dwellers, the displaced peoples, the subsistence farmers. Fanon pinpointed this third group as the absolute greatest threat to the colonial system. Why? Because they were viewed as disposable excess. They literally had nothing to lose and nothing to offer the colonizer.
Okay, we need to impartially look at his most controversial thesis here. Fanon theorized that violent resistance was a necessary precondition for liberation. His reasoning was that the colonizer maintained control through sheer military strength, so violence was essentially the only language the system understood. But on a deeper, psychological level, he believed that because the colonized had internalized such a deep sense of inferiority, violent resistance acted like a psychological defibrillator. It was the shock needed to literally break the chains of subjugation, shake off that heavy inferiority complex, and awaken the suppressed humanity of the colonized so they could start forming a totally new identity.
But to be clear, Fanon didn't view resistance as just random, nihilistic chaos. He saw it as a highly purposeful, three-step methodology. Step 1. Say a definitive, non-negotiable no to the colonial system. Step 2. Dismantle those relations of extraction and economic exploitation. And Step 3. Actively form a new post-colonial cultural and political identity. It was all about world-making from the ground up, not just taking over the colonizer's old institutions.
Section 5. Fanon's Enduring Global Legacy. The Future is a Break with the Past. Let's look at how his ideas reverberated across the globe, proving that for Fanon, the future really is a complete break with the past.
The ripple effect of his theories was absolutely massive, long after his premature death. The ideas spread like wildfire. They directly influenced the Black Power movement in the U.S. Stokely Carmichael actually quoted Fanon extensively when he was formulating the politics of Black liberation. The work became the bedrock for modern postcolonial theory and Afro-pessimist studies. His ideas inspired Latin American leftists, indigenous movements fighting for decolonization, and South African anti-apartheid activists resisting systemic segregation. His voice resonated anywhere people were feeling the crushing weight of systemic oppression.
Ultimately, Fanon was making a plea for a brand new humanism. He was practically begging the formerly colonized world to invent new concepts of collectivity. Don't just imitate Europe, he argued. He aggressively rejected the idea of just copying European statecraft because he saw Europe's history as being way too tied up in violence, slavery, and exploitation. He wanted the Third World to start from scratch and create a completely unprecedented, original history of humanity.
We're going to wrap up this explainer with a really powerful, lingering plea from the very end of his first book, Black Skin, White Masks. He writes, "O my body, make of me always a man who questions." By staying in the interrogative, Fanon believed we refuse to be locked into the rigid boxes created by history or by oppressors. It's an incredible reminder of the vital importance of constant intellectual interrogation. Keep questioning the structures around you. Keep learning. So, what structures are you going to question today? Thank you for joining me to explore the legacy of Frantz Fanon.